Hello, I'm Tristram Hooley and I'm recording a lecture for the Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences. In this lecture I'm going to be looking at what the labour market is, and it's part of a series that I'm doing looking at the context for careers. So I often use this definition that career is the individual's journey through life, learning and work, but in many cases the work element is seen as being particularly important to that journey. So we're going to focus in on that in the context of the labour market in this lecture. So there are many different ways to allocate people to jobs and to work. Here we've got the Harry Potter sorting hat, which was one way to decide where people should fit and where people should go. Now, in other societies, there have been many ways in which people are allocated to work. You could follow in your father or mother's footsteps. You could be perhaps allocated to jobs that the economy particularly needs, like we saw in some of the Soviet systems. And so there are many different ways in which people can be allocated to work. But in our society, we have focus on markets as a way of establishing how things should work. So a market is a place where two parties can gather to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. The parties involved are usually buyers and sellers. The market may be physical, as in this picture, where people meet face to face, or it could be virtual, as an online market where there's no direct physical contact between buyers and sellers. And markets are mechanisms which capitalist societies and other forms of market societies use to allocate goods and services to people. So a labour market then is one where labour or work is exchanged for money. So a labour market uses this principle of a market form of allocation, that we allocate stuff by who can pay and what people have to exchange in favour of money, and we apply that to the allocation of work and opportunities. So in a labour market, people are both choosing a career and they're also being chosen for a career. And that's, I think, a very important distinction, which highlights why context is so important when we're thinking about careers, because it raises the question of who is doing the choosing and on what basis. So a labour market operates through the principles of supply and demand. So normally we talk about the availability of workers as the supply in this type of market. So in a situation where we have a lot of workers, we have a high availability of workers. And then employers might have a need for workers. They perhaps have work that needs doing. Now, in a situation where we have a lot of workers, but we have a relatively limited need for those workers, then employers have more power. There are many people normally who would choose to do a job, and so they can drive wages down and conditions down and so on, if that's what they want to do. Similarly, on the other side, if we have a high need for workers and not so many workers available, then workers have more power. So this is following the basic principles of supply and demand that we see in many market-based systems, and it's applying it to that process of the labour market. However, despite a lot of talk that you might have heard about free markets, in fact there is no such thing as a free market, certainly not a free market in labour. So a labour market is constrained by all sorts of things, and this is not a comprehensive list, but we might include things that constrain the operation of a labour market as things like labour law, so what you're allowed to do. Perhaps you've got a law that says that somebody's not allowed to work in a very highly dangerous conditions, and that you have to put some safety precautions in place. That shapes the availability, the need for labour, the cost of labour, and so on. We also have unions which negotiate on behalf of workers, and cartels or other forms of employer organisation that negotiate on behalf of employers. And both of those are seeking to either drive up or drive down wages, drive up or drive down conditions, and so on. But the state also plays an important role. It offers benefits and subsidies to both employees and employers that change the context for it. And the government itself, in most advanced capitalist countries, is also a major employer and has the capacity to set some of the conditions of the labour market through its direct role as an employer of workers. Governments may also adopt policies like minimum and even maximum wage policies that limit how salaries are allocated. They might have other kinds of pay policies, for example, encouraging firms only to increase pay by a certain amount a year to limit inflation. And also very important is skills and education policies, because not everybody can do every job. And so the availability of high numbers of skilled people who can do the jobs that people need is important, and that's strongly related to education policies. Then finally, migration policies can also make a big shift in the way the labour market operates, allowing workers to come in from other countries and so on. So the labour market is complex, it's embedded in politics, but it is ultimately at the root of it is a market where the supply of labour and the demand of labour and the supply of skills and the demand for skills are exchanged for money. One of the ways in which labour markets are constrained is that labour markets are often highly localised. So if I'm sitting in Oslo and I see a fantastic job in the north of Norway, I can't really just commute there every day. It's not within my travel to work distance. So I have to consider whether I want to move or not. And these things all reduce the ability of people to take up the jobs that they might want to. So labour markets are not national, they're not global, they're highly local, they're also quite individual, because somebody who owns a car, for example, will have a longer travel to work distance than somebody who owns a bike. And when we're working with clients and thinking about careers, then all of these issues start to come into play. So it's not simply about finding the job that pays the most, it's also about finding the job that is most accessible to the person. Labour markets are also structured and organised by sectors, and this is a very simple way of dividing up sectors. In labour markets, we can divide it in many ways, but we have primary sectors, so the extraction of raw materials, so that might be things like mining or farming, then manufacturing, utilities and construction as our secondary sectors, and finally our tertiary sectors, service sectors. But what this reminds us is that there might be skills and knowledge and networks that operate to keep people within their sector. So if you've always worked in education, you're probably not going to easily be able to move into mining. You probably won't have the right skills, the right experience, the right networks to do so. So labour markets are not just open negotiations between a quantity of labour and a quantity of need. They're also a complex organisation of different skills, knowledge, networks, and so on. And that's also true when we think about occupations, because occupations require different skills and experience. Now, it's important to recognise that different occupations may exist within different sectors, and that's quite an important distinction. So, for example, we might have people whose occupation is working in something like computer programming, and that person might be in demand across a wide range of sectors. So there may be a need for computer programmers in education, there may be a need for computer programmers in manufacturing, in finance, and so on. In some cases, their skills may be transferable from one sector to another, and in other cases, less so. What this figure here is, which is produced by Skills Norway, does is it shows us how different occupations, or groups of occupations in this case, are help us to understand how people get paid differently. And it tells us that there are some sectors where people are paid much more than other sectors, and there are some occupations where people are paid much more than in other occupations, perhaps because they have different amounts of skill, or perhaps because those occupations are more powerful or better financially rewarded. So the labour market is complex. There's many features going on in it. I'm not going to show you all of them in this talk, but this gives you some examples. Now, as a careers professional, you don't have to be an economist and understand everything about the labour market. There is a lot of information available, and you can't hope to try and process all of it, everything from bus timetables through to GDP growth. But I think you do need to think about your role in working with clients as you talk about the labour market. So you should have an interest in the labour market because it provides the primary context for career. And you can adopt a range of different roles with clients. So you can signpost them to information. You can become a dispenser of information. You can draw together resources and information and give that to your clients as you're talking to them. You can help them to interpret it, perhaps help people who are not used to looking at this kind of data and information to understand what is the difference between a sector and a occupation. What does travel to work distance mean? And what is gross domestic product or whatever else? You can become a tour guide, perhaps showing them some things where there are some really important bits of information that they should look at. Perhaps understanding, for example, that you can find out what qualifications are needed by different occupations and what kinds of salaries and rates of return and working conditions you might expect if you move into those things. Explaining to people that these things are well documented, that there is information available on them, and that there is a pattern in them is very helpful. And I think we also have a role ultimately to become something of a teacher about the labour market, to understand it better than our students and our clients and help them to learn more about it. I provide some references here just to give you some things to have a look at and some further resources. But in summary, the labour market, I think, offers the primary context for a career. It's neither random nor natural. It doesn't just happen. It's the product of political and economic decision making. And because of that, individuals have to learn to read and navigate the labour market as they manage their careers. And careers professionals have an important role in helping them to do this. Thank you for listening. I hope some of that has been of interest.